Yes, this is very important to know. Prior to 1916, there were no Arab states for many, many centuries. Perhaps the last Arab state as such was in Fatimid Egypt, going back to the medieval period. That was a long time ago. There was no Arab state called Iraq, there was no Arab state called Syria, and there was no Arab state called Palestine. All these states were created by the same document, which I have called the San Remo Resolution. And why should the Arabs condemn the Jews for getting their state when they got their own states under the same, from the same document, from the same origin? It's so hypocritical on their part to talk about colonialism when they were the greatest benefactors of what the principal Allied powers did. The principal Allied powers, particularly Britain and France, lost millions of soldiers who were killed in World War I, and the Arabs contributed practically nothing to the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, and here they were the greatest benefactors. And the reason the reason that Palestine was set aside for the Jewish people was because of the historical connection, which went back 3,800 years to the time of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was because of the historical connection that Palestine was allotted to the Jewish people. I mean, it made sense, but there was no Arab connection to Palestine.
To speak in headlines, it is the San Remo Conference of 1920, which is the focus point here of the sovereignty for the Jewish people to the land.
Yes,
in many ways.
Yes, this is my thesis. It's the thesis that I formulated in my book, The Legal Foundation and Borders of Israel and International Law. This is the thesis that I formulated, that sovereignty was devolved or vested with the Jewish people from the time the Balfour Declaration was adopted on April 24, 1920 at the San Remo Peace Conference. And the reason I say that is because at the San Remo Peace Conference, Britain was required not only to use their best endeavors, which was the Balfour Declaration of 1917, but rather to put into effect the Balfour Declaration. The British obligation changed from one of permissiveness to promising to use their best endeavors to one that they had to have the result, an obligation of specific performance. Now, the Balfour Declaration was combined with Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. The two together formed sovereignty over Palestine, and that was given to the Jewish people, de jure sovereignty. Now, it was a great point of contention during the whole mandate period, who had sovereignty over a mandated territory. The question was actually never answered during this time period. No one knew the answer. It's obvious now, with the passage of time, that the mandatory did not have sovereignty because they had to implement the terms of the mandate, and they were subject to the terms of the mandate. It states specifically in Article 1 of the mandate that they have the administration and power of legislation, but they must conform to the terms of the mandate. They couldn't pass any laws that were inconsistent with the mandate. So they didn't have, for instance, Britain could not have abolished the Jewish national home. They didn't have the right to do that under the terms of the mandate. The same thing goes for the League of Nations Council. The Council of the League of Nations had a function to supervise the observance of the mandate by the mandatory power. The Council, which was aided by the Permanent Mandates Commission, They went and their function was to supervise whether the mandatory power was fulfilling its obligations. And actually, as we know, they came to the conclusion that Britain did not do that. So the two, as I said, the two things together resulted in Jewish sovereignty, because neither the mandatory power Britain nor the League of Nations had sovereignty. Now, sovereignty basically is who has supreme authority, who can dispose of the land. Who was it? It was the coalition of principal Allied powers, the victors of World War I, who fought against the Central Powers. The principal Allied powers, as I mentioned earlier, were Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. The Central Powers were Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria, joined by Turkey. And the principal Allied powers defeated the Central Powers, and they decided who would get what. And that was done at the Paris Peace Conference. They made the distribution of the Ottoman territories, and it was they who originally had sovereignty. Now, I'm not making this up. This was actually inserted in Article 132 of the Treaty of Sèvres. It says so specifically there, that sovereignty was vested in the beginning. Once the Ottoman Empire was conquered, sovereignty passed to the principal Allied powers. They, in turn, decided who would get what. And they passed the sovereignty to the Jewish people over Palestine. I call it the two-step approach, or the two-tier procedure. In the first instance, sovereignty passed from Ottoman Turkey to the principal Allied powers as a collective body. And at the San Remo Peace Conference, that sovereignty was then devolved to each of the national beneficiaries of the mandates. There were three categories of mandates, A, B, and C. Palestine was among the Class A mandates, together with Iraq and Syria.
Yeah.
And this was done at the San Remo Peace Conference.
Exactly. Today, it's said that the settlements, the Jewish presence in Judea, Samaria, the so-called West Bank, is the obstacle to peace and the main problem for the region. Yes. To create peace. Yes. But actually what you say is that Israel has absolutely right, the Jewish people has absolutely right to stay and live in this area.
Yes, and I say that
regarding international law.
Yes, regarding international law, and anyone who's familiar with the political, diplomatic, and legal history of the period wouldn't deny that. The whole problem is that people who claim that settlements are illegal simply have erased the history, the diplomatic and legal history of the entire period up to 1947, 48, and some of them go right up to 67. Of course, if you start from 1967, and if you assume that Jordan was the sovereign, then you can say that the settlements are legal, but you can't start from that basis. The departure point is not 1967. It should get into the heads of these people that you gotta start from the right departure point. The right departure point is the years 1915 to 1925, when all the documents of international law were formulated and the Ottoman Empire was divided and territories allotted to different national beneficiaries. You don't start from the wrong departure point. If you don't start from the United Nations General Assembly resolution of November 29, 1947. And certainly you don't start from the Six-Day War of June 5, 1967. Look, in 1920, a boundary convention was concluded between Great Britain and France. They spent the whole year, most of 1920, negotiating that boundary convention. It was called the Franco-British Boundary Convention of December 23, 1920, and was signed by the French Prime Minister at the time, Georges Legues, and the British ambassador to Paris. And in that boundary convention, Judea, Samaria, and Gaza were specifically included within the Jewish national home, within Palestine. The two were one and the same thing. And this was never changed. Judea, Samaria, and Gaza were Jewish designated land, both by Britain and France. They have forgotten this. This is absolutely terrible that people who have, that nations that have that have agreed among themselves that the Jews would have Palestine and can settle throughout the land, including Judea and Samaria, now deny that they ever did that. That is terrible. It goes against previous agreements. Now, in international law, there's such a thing as estoppel. That is, you can't deny something that you previously accepted and agreed to. Both Britain and France and all the nations who were members of the League of Nations in 1922, those were 52 nations who were members in 1922, plus the United States was not a member, but they signed a separate treaty. They recognized that Palestine was to be the Jewish national home, which meant that settlement could take place anywhere in the Jewish national home. I mean, that's what Jewish national home meant.
Why is that so few politicians, or hardly anyone, is referring to the San Remo Conference, to these events, all the time that they were creating international law?
Yes, because the quick answer to that question is this. The minutes of the San Remo Peace Conference, or what's called in French the procès-verbaux, the minutes, they were not published until 1958. So that very few people actually became aware of what the San Remo Peace Conference actually agreed to. They simply did not know, or they didn't care to know, that the Jews were given the rights over all of Palestine. Unfortunately, in 1920, all that was told about the San Remo Peace Conference was that mandates were issued. One mandate to Great Britain for Palestine, one mandate to Great Britain for Mesopotamia, that later changed its name to Iraq, and one mandate to Syria that subsequently divided it into Syria and Lebanon. So that's all that was known about the San Remo Peace Conference. It wasn't until they actually published the minutes. To this very day, it's still not too well known. I started to work on this question in the 1980s. I made the first mention of it in 1989 in an article in the Jewish Press, and the person for whom I worked as legal advisor on Eretz Israel under international law, Professor Yuval Neiman, he was the minister in the Shamir cabinet. He published an article in which he said that the Jewish state owes its existence not to the UN General Assembly resolution of 1947, but to the San Remo resolution, a term that I more or less coined to indicate the entire agreement, not merely the granting of the mandates, but the entire agreement. I started writing about this. I wrote several articles that appeared in the Hebrew journal Natif in the 1990s. That I put forth this thesis in my book, and it's the first chapter of my book, and it's the most important chapter.
Okay, thank you for coming to this program, Howard Grief.
Thank you for the opportunity you're giving me to explain Israel's ironclad case to the people of Norway. I'm honored to be here.